For centuries, the nearly 4,300-kilometer border between Russia and China was a line of conflict. It was defined by barbed wire, armed guards, and even pitched battles on the frozen Amur River in 1969. This was one of the world's most tense and militarized frontiers. Today, that same frontier is buzzing with activity. It's a massive construction zone, with new bridges, pipelines, and even cities rising all at once. But this is more than just two countries getting friendlier. This is the physical construction of a new economic reality, one where a border stops being a barrier. And it's all happening faster than almost anyone realizes. This is the story of how two of the world's great powers aren't just redrawing the map, they're erasing the lines that once defined it. It's a transformation built on concrete, steel, and a shared vision of a world that doesn't revolve around Washington, D.C. But to really get what a huge deal this is, you have to understand just how deep the bad blood ran. You have to go back to a time when this border wasn't a bridge, but a battlefield, drenched in centuries of mistrust. The story of the Sino-Russian border is really a story about power. It's a narrative written in treaties signed under duress and battles fought in the harshest conditions imaginable. For 3.5 centuries, this was a place of division, not connection. The very idea of a shared border was like an open wound, a source of humiliation for one side and a strategic prize for the other. It all starts back in the 17th century, with two expanding empires pushing into the vast, empty expanse of Siberia and Manchuria. The Tsardom of Russia, hungry for furs and land, pushed east. China's Qing dynasty, at the peak of its power, pushed north. They finally met along the Amur River basin, and the first chapter of their long, troubled relationship was written in conflict. The first real attempt to draw a line was the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. This was a landmark deal, and not just for them. It was the first treaty China ever signed with a European power, and it was negotiated on surprisingly equal terms. The powerful Qing dynasty forced the Russians to retreat north, away from the Amur River. For China, it was a clear victory. For Russia, it was a strategic withdrawal, a temporary setback. They wouldn't forget the lands they had to give up. For the next 150 years, that line mostly held. But empires rise and fall. By the mid-19th century, the tables had turned dramatically. The Qing dynasty was in a state of terminal decline, humbled by the West in the Opium Wars and torn apart by internal rebellions. China was being carved up, and Russia saw its chance. This is the era of what China calls the unequal treaties, a period seared into the country's collective memory as a time of profound national humiliation. In 1858, with the Qing court distracted by war with Britain and France, Russia sailed down the Amur River and gave the local Chinese commander a stark choice. With no way to contact Beijing and facing a superior Russian force, he signed the Treaty of Aigun. With the stroke of a pen, the border moved. A huge chunk of territory north of the Amur River, over 600,000 square kilometers that was Chinese under the old treaty, was now Russian. 2 years later, in 1860, Russia pressed its advantage. Posing as a helpful mediator after Western powers sacked Beijing, Russia demanded another prize for its services. The Convention of Peking was signed, and another 400,000 square kilometers of Chinese land east of the Ussuri River was handed over to the Tsar. This gave Russia the crucial coastline of the maritime province and access to the Pacific Ocean. On this newly acquired land, they founded a port city and gave it a name that was a bold statement: Vladivostok, ruler of the East. For Russia, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. For China, it was a catastrophic loss. These two treaties created the border we largely know today, but they didn't create peace. They planted the seeds of a deep-seated grievance that would fester for another century. The 20th century saw the old empires collapse, replaced by revolutionary communist states. For a short time, the Soviet Union and the new People's Republic of China were allies, brothers in the socialist cause. But that brotherhood was paper-thin, and the unresolved border dispute was a fault line just waiting to crack. By the 1960s, the Sino-Soviet split had become a chasm. Ideological squabbles between Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev spiraled into a bitter rivalry. Moscow saw itself as the leader of the communist world, and Beijing refused to be a junior partner. The old border issue became the perfect proxy for this larger fight. Beijing started to publicly question the unequal treaties. They didn't demand all the land back, but they insisted Moscow admit the treaties were unjust before any new talks could begin. Moscow's stance was rigid. The border was final and non-negotiable. The border itself transformed into an iron curtain in the east. It became one of the most heavily militarized frontiers on the planet, with millions of troops staring each other down across the Amur and Ussuri rivers. This tension finally exploded into open conflict in 1969. The flashpoint was a tiny, uninhabited island in the Ussuri River, Zhenbao to the Chinese, Damansky to the Russians. On a frozen March morning, Chinese border guards ambushed a Soviet patrol. The clash that followed was brutal, involving machine guns, mortars, and eventually tanks. The fighting around Zhenbao/Damansky, followed by other serious clashes on the border later that year, brought the world's two largest communist powers to the very brink of a full-scale, potentially nuclear war. For a terrifying moment, the world held its breath as Moscow openly debated a preemptive nuclear strike on China. The 1969 conflict was a wake-up call. It proved the border was a live, bleeding wound. The fighting ended in a tense stalemate, but for the next 2 decades, the frontier was a symbol of pure division. For the better part of a century, this was the normal that defined their relationship. A frontier of fear, frozen in time by mistrust and the barrel of a gun. It seemed impossible that this could ever change, but ideologies, like empires, have a way of falling. The stalemate on the border finally began to crack, not with a bang, but with a speech. In 1986, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, struggling with a disastrous war in Afghanistan and a collapsing economy, went to Vladivostok, the very symbol of Russia's 19th century gains, and announced a radical new direction. In his Vladivostok speech, Gorbachev did something no Soviet leader had ever done. He signaled a willingness to compromise. He showed he was open to genuine negotiations on the border issue, which paved the way for Moscow to later accept the internationally recognized principle that the border should run down the main channel of the Amur and Ussuri rivers. This was a huge concession, and the principle China had demanded for decades. He was opening the door, just a crack, to real talks. This was the beginning of the Great Thaw. Drained by the Cold War and desperate for stability, both sides were finally ready to bury the hatchet. The process was slow and painstaking, a methodical chipping away at a century of accumulated mistrust. It even outlasted the Soviet Union itself. The first major breakthrough came in 1991, just months before the hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for good. The Sino-Soviet border agreement was signed, settling the vast majority of the long eastern section of the border. It was a quiet diplomatic triumph, overshadowed by the seismic collapse of the USSR. The new Russian Federation inherited the agreement and, to its credit, honored it. In 1994, a second agreement settled the smaller western section. With these two treaties, almost the entire length of one of the world's longest land border disputes was formally resolved. But the word "almost" is key. A few thorny patches remained. 3 specific islands, left unresolved, became symbols of the last vestiges of conflict. These included Tarabarov Island, Yinlong in Chinese, and parts of Bolshoi Ussuriski Island, Hixiazi, both right next to the major Russian city of Khabarovsk. These islands were small, but their symbolic weight was enormous. For Russian nationalists, giving up any land their soldiers had defended was treason. For China, reclaiming them was a matter of historical justice. For years, the issue was deadlocked. The final breakthrough came in the early 2000s. The geopolitical landscape had changed yet again. Both Russia and China were growing wary of American dominance in a unipolar world and found their strategic interests aligning. The lingering border dispute was now just an irritant, a relic holding back a deeper partnership. It had to be solved. In 2004, a landmark supplementary agreement was signed. This was the final piece of the puzzle, and a true compromise. Russia agreed to transfer all of Tarabarov/Yinlong Island and about half of Bolshoi-Ussuriski/Hexiazi Island to China. In return, China dropped its remaining claims, and the border was finalized. The actual transfer of land took place between 2005 and 2008. In quiet ceremonies, border markers were moved, Russian flags were lowered, and Chinese flags were raised. On October 14, 2008, it was all made official. For the first time in 350 years, the entire 4,300-kilometer border was legally defined, fully demarcated, and mutually recognized. The conflict was over. The importance of this moment can't be overstated. It removed the main source of military tension and distrust that had poisoned their relationship for generations. It transformed the border from a potential war zone into a zone of peace and stability. This new diplomatic trust became the bedrock for everything that was to come. With the fear of conflict gone, the border was no longer a liability to be defended, but an asset to be developed. The wall of mistrust had been torn down, and the stage was set for an even more dramatic transformation, the physical and economic erasure of the border. With the political disputes finally settled, China and Russia began dismantling the physical barrier the border had become. For decades, this frontier was a Cold War dead zone. Now it's undergoing a staggering construction blitz. This isn't a slow evolution. It's a coordinated, high-speed push. It's like an Iron Curtain in reverse, a 4,300-kilometer zone where two countries are pouring billions into making things move faster and in greater volume. In just the last few years, they've launched over a dozen simultaneous megaprojects: new bridges, rail lines, pipelines, and special economic zones. Every single one is designed to bind the two nations together, creating an integrated economic space where the border is just a line you cross, not a wall that stops you. Let's travel the border to see the scale of it. Way out east, the Tongjiang-Nizhne-Leninskoye railway bridge stretches across the Amur River. Before this, there were no permanent rail bridges over this part of the border. Goods had to be painstakingly moved by ferry in summer or driven over treacherous ice roads in winter. The bridge, which opened in late 2022, was a game-changer. It's the first-ever railway bridge across the Amur connecting the two countries. The impact was immediate. Russian coal and iron ore started rolling into China. For Chinese goods going the other way, the bridge slashed the transport distance by an estimated 700 kilometers or more. This isn't just a minor improvement, it's a fundamental rerouting of continental supply chains. A few hundred kilometers west, you get to the cities of Heihe, China, and Blagoveshchensk, Russia, staring at each other across the river. The only way to cross used to be by seasonal ferry or a shaky pontoon bridge. Then came the Blagoveshchensk-Heihe highway bridge. It opened for freight in June 2022, becoming the first permanent road bridge across the Amur between the two nations. When passenger travel began, the flow of people and goods exploded. In 2024, the passenger volume between the two cities surged to 760,000, and total trade through Heihe hit over $4 billion. This bridge didn't just connect two cities, it's fusing them into a single cross-border metro area. But the most futuristic project might be the Blagoveshchensk-Heihe cable car. This isn't a tourist ride. It's billed as the world's first cross-border public transit cable car. When it's finished, it will whisk passengers from one country to the other in under 10 minutes, with a terminal that blends customs, shopping, and entertainment. It's a vision of a border that is not just seamless, but a destination. Travel further west and you find the arteries of this new relationship, the pipelines. The Power of Siberia pipeline came online in late 2019. This 3,000-kilometer steel serpent snakes from the gas fields of eastern Siberia down to China. The pipeline is ramping up toward its full capacity of 38 billion cubic meters per year, a target it's expected to reach around 2025. This single pipeline gives China a secure land-based source of energy and gives Russia a guaranteed market to replace lost customers in Europe. But that's just the start. The two nations have been in tough negotiations for an even bigger project, the Power of Siberia 2. This pipeline would be a monster, designed to carry 50 billion cubic meters of gas annually from the same West Siberian fields that once supplied Europe. The deal isn't signed yet. China is driving a hard bargain on price, but the strategic logic for both sides is immense. If it gets built, it will physically link China to Russia's core energy infrastructure, completing the reorientation of Russia's energy flows from west to east. This goes beyond just a few big projects. All along the frontier, old railway tunnels are being modernized, and joint customs green channels are slashing clearance times. And then there's Hixiazi Island, the very island that was a centerpiece of the final border deal. Once a symbol of division, it's now being reimagined as a symbol of cooperation. Following a 2024 agreement to jointly develop the island, there are ambitious plans to turn it into an international cooperation zone. China is building a new border crossing on its side, slated for completion by the end of 2026, with the hope of starting passenger traffic in 2027. The vision is to turn this former point of contention into a bustling hub of trade and tourism. This is the physical reality of the erasing border. It's a conscious, deliberate strategy. China is linking its massive Belt and Road Initiative with Russia's Eurasian Economic Union, with the goal of integrating their infrastructure. Bilateral trade has exploded, hitting a record-breaking $240 billion in 2023. And more, this trade is happening in their own currencies, the yuan and the ruble, chipping away at the dominance of the US dollar. The Cold War border was a line you couldn't cross. The new border is a corridor designed for speed. Every crane, every bridge, and every pipeline is re-engineering the flow of power and resources across the Eurasian continent. The erasure of the Sino-Russian border isn't just about bridges and trade stats. It's a tectonic shift in the geopolitical landscape, creating a new axis of power. This isn't a formal military alliance like in the Cold War, but a deep, pragmatic alignment of interests and a shared opposition to the Western-led world order. The final border settlement was the foundation, but the real catalyst has been steady, increasing pressure from the West. The 2014 annexation of Crimea and, most profoundly, the 2022 invasion of Ukraine have each pushed Russia further from Europe and deeper into the arms of China. For Russia, sanctioned and isolated by the West, China is an economic lifeline, a huge market for its energy and a source of vital technology. For China, the benefits are just as big. A secure, friendly Russia provides a stable strategic rear, freeing China to focus its power eastward, toward Taiwan and the Pacific. It offers a massive land-based source of energy and raw materials, reducing China's reliance on maritime supply routes controlled by the U.S. Navy. And in Russia, China has a partner with a UN Security Council veto and a shared desire to challenge American dominance. This is often called a no-limits friendship. Of course, there are limits, as the tough negotiations over the power of Siberia 2 pipeline show. It's a deeply asymmetrical relationship. China is the undisputed senior partner, the economic giant. But for now, their goals are aligned. As President Xi Jinping has said, their relationship is a ballast stone for global stability, part of a vision for a multipolar world where America is no longer the sole superpower. What does this mean for the United States? It presents a major strategic challenge, a coordinated two-front rivalry across the vast Eurasian landmass. The U.S. must now contend with Chinese power in the Pacific and Russian military activity in Europe, knowing the two are increasingly coordinating. Sanctions, America's weapon of choice, become less effective when Russia can simply pivot its economy to a China that is willing and able to absorb its exports. The integrated Sino-Russian economic space is forming an alternative bloc, less dependent on Western markets, technology, and financial systems like SWIFT. For Asia, the implications are just as dramatic. The deepening Sino-Russian axis complicates security across the region. A united front from Beijing and Moscow makes any effort to deal with North Korea vastly more difficult. In the South China Sea, Russian diplomatic support emboldens China in its disputes. And in Central Asia, economic corridors are pulling the entire region deeper into Beijing's orbit. Nations like Japan, South Korea, India, and others watch this with growing alarm. They face a more confident China, backed by a resource-rich Russia. This forces them into difficult choices, pushing them to strengthen security alliances, often with the United States, and raising the stakes across the Indo-Pacific. Interestingly, China is also hedging its bets. It's actively investing in a middle corridor for trade with Europe that bypasses Russia entirely. This shows the pragmatism at the heart of Beijing's strategy. It will work with Russia to challenge the West, but it won't become wholly dependent on Moscow. It's building a network where all roads eventually lead to Beijing. In essence, the erasing of the border has become a powerful tool in their geopolitical toolkit. It helps cushion Russia from Western attempts at isolation and secures critical supply chains for China. Most importantly, it projects a powerful vision to the rest of the world that a viable, non-Western global order is possible. This story is unfolding in real time, with new projects and geopolitical shifts happening every month. To stay on top of these complex developments and understand the forces shaping our world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let me know in the comments, what do you think the next phase of this no-limits partnership will look like? From a frozen river battle in 1969 to a ribbon cutting on a new bridge decades later, the story of the Sino-Russian border is a transformation that's nothing short of stunning. A line of conflict has been erased, not from the maps, but in its function. A barrier has become a bridge. A wall of mistrust has been replaced by a corridor of power. This is more than just infrastructure. It's the physical manifestation of a new global alignment. The long, cold frontier between the dragon and the bear has thawed, and in its place, a new reality is being paved, piped, and welded into existence, fundamentally reshaping the power dynamics of the 21st century.